This is Burn This Book, a banned books book club where we, Nicole and Eden, read a banned or challenged book twice a month and discuss its meaning, impact, and censorship to make it more accessible for all readers. This week's book is Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Beloved by Toni Morrison, which was published in 1987. Yeah. Oh, that's very apt because it is a ghost story.
Ooh.
So Beloved is a story, just a quick summary. It has two storylines, one in the past, one in the present. Present as in like 1880s? Yeah, 1880s. And it follows a family, Setha and her daughter Denver, and Paul D, who Setha knew from her past. And there's a ghost who visits them. It seems malevolent, and it drove away two of Setha's kids already. But then a mysterious woman. How am I supposed to? This is quite the story.
I think context is important. Setha is a freed slave. This is
Thank you.
During Reconstruction, she grew up in slavery at a plantation called Sweet Home. It was horrific and very cruel. And upon when she was freed, she left and found a home in Cincinnati, Ohio. And this story follows Setha and her family at that point in Cincinnati, Ohio, and what brought them there and who this ghost is that Eden was talking about that's visiting them. And the story begins to kind of unravel, so we get to find out who the ghost is and why the ghost is angry and what's happened to the rest of the family.
Great. Cut out all of my parts.
No, stop. Stop. No, your part was great. We need both of them. We need both of them.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. And go ahead, Eden.
Yeah, so I read this book in high school. Did you read it in high school as well, Nicole?
I did read it in high school. I read it in my AP literature class.
Same with me. It was interesting. I kind of want to talk about this book and the impact of this book on us growing up in predominantly white schools.
Yeah.
Like, why do you think it was taught to white students in these schools?
So my perspective on it is, well, it's history. It's based on a true story. So here's a massive spoiler alert. The ghost is actually Setha's eldest daughter. When she had been freed, the white folk came back to Cincinnati and found her, and Setha, and they were going to take the children because they technically could have been brought back into slavery because of different, laws or loopholes and stuff like that. And instead of allowing her children to go back into slavery, she tried to kill all of them because death was better than becoming slaves. She only managed to harm her two sons, but she managed to kill her eldest daughter. Her third daughter, she was just about to bash in her head in, and the white men were like, "Whoa, this lady is crazy. We don't want her. Like, we don't want any of her offspring either. We don't want any of this. This is crazy." And Setha ended up, I think she had to go to jail for a time. And so she was, and she became like the community pariah for trying to kill her children. But the reader understands that it was because slavery was just so atrocious that death was a better alternative. And so we find out that this ghost is that eldest daughter who's returned and is angry, doesn't understand why she was killed, doesn't understand all of this stuff. And in a way, we are all kind of that ghost, trying to be like, why on earth would you kill your kid? Why would you do that? And the anger that Setha is receiving from this ghost, she tries to find ways to pacify this ghost. They become really codependent, and it becomes the demise of both of them eventually. Toni Morrison found out about this story, a story similar to this, in a newspaper clipping from that time. And she was like, okay, I'm curious about this. I want to explore this. Why would this woman kill her child? And so that's why she wrote this story. So as coming from a school, mostly white students with a white teacher, we read it, and what it did was it turned the conversation of slavery, which we'd had so often, and we know it's bad, we know these things, but it made it really real, and it made it very clear of what it did to every single character in that book, whether it was the white people, the slave owners, or the enslaved people. You saw it mangle their souls, and you saw it completely change their humanity, each person's, into desperation. Like the white people were constantly trying to justify their choice to participate in slavery by like doing these horrible exercises. Like the school teacher was this horrible man, and he would do these like really dehumanizing exercises with the children. And it was clear that it was because he was trying to justify it to himself that they deserved to be enslaved. And so I think it's taught because we need to feel the humanity of it. We need to feel the realness of how horrible it was, you know?
Yeah. And that news clipping that you're talking about, it's about the enslaved woman Margaret Garner, who she ended up killing her child, and the courts usually settle runaway, quote unquote, runaway slave cases within a day, but they couldn't figure out how to try her case because they didn't know whether to try Margaret Garner as murdering a person or as destroying property. So that was like bone chilling to me, of just realizing, they couldn't this case was like dragged out for as long as it was. Maybe it was just like a couple weeks, but still, like compared to a single day, because they couldn't figure it out. It's like, is this baby property? Which is wild. I also think like
that's horrific.
It is horrific, and the whole even the whole case is very interesting. Like the people who came to Margaret Garner's defense, they would say like, if you understood what it was like for a half white, half black slave to be on a plantation, they take more abuses because of the inherent, like they are the visible embodiment of quote unquote sin, because there was infidelity from a slave owner, the infidelity of a slave owner. And so in a way she was protecting her child. Well, in her mind, and the way we see it in history, like she was protecting her child not only from slavery, but from the further abuses that a not fully black slave would have faced.
Which just goes into like the how gruesome colorism is, and how race is a social construct that those in power, the white population, used in order to say this shade of this tone, designates this level of whatever. A resource I would highly recommend is Laura's Plantation. It is a plantation in the New Orleans area, and it is one of the most thorough plantation tours because they actually go in and talk about colorism, and they center the lives of the enslaved families, because it was owned by a Creole family, which is also complicated. But it goes into that kind of complex history that Eden just described. So if you are looking for a plantation tour ever, don't support the ones that just center the plantation owners and like kind of do the whole like, we miss the antebellum South. Go to places like Laura's Plantation that center the stories of the families who experienced it and who were harmed by it, and the families whose descendants still live in the area. Because I think like they're the ones that built the plantation too. So, but Laura's Plantation goes into that conversation about colorism and about what it means to be Creole or what it means to be mixed on a plantation. And at what point does the white preacher decide you have a soul? How much white do you have to have in you before you can be baptized? Before you're allowed to be baptized? It's like, it's so, it's like so many mental gymnastics that white people were doing to justify this oppression and control over another population. It's wild. Eden, one fact check for myself was that the newspaper article is from 1856. So, and you can also read about that article in an anthology of texts of Black history and culture that Toni Morrison had edited in 1974 called The Black Book. So if you want to read those types of things, which would be amazing, honestly, I need to go buy that. I love bookshop.org. But Eden, why do you think your school taught it in Connecticut? And also, like, as one of the non-white students in your classroom, did it impact you differently, even though you're not Black, or was it still? Yeah, I'm curious about your experience with it as a kid.
Yeah. So one was okay. Yesterday, I was Marco Poloing a friend and telling her how I was preparing for this discussion, and I was talking about, I think we can talk about it from the angle of like how it impacted us white kids. And I said us white kids, which was really interesting, and probably like a reflection of like my own assimilation in my white community.
Yeah.
And probably like model minority stuff.
Yeah.
But I feel like when I read, and it could be my upbringing in America, but like when I read books about slavery or anything, I do, because I feel like I'm learning about it, like the white kids in my class are learning about it. So I, in a way, identify as white in that perspective, in that context. And like even within Asia, there's like a bunch of colorism as well, because like that comes from, if you're darker skinned, you are working out in the sun, which means like manual labor. If you're lighter skinned, that means you have more time to be lounging around at home.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think colorism, is complex and can be is found throughout like many cultures, as well.
I think
it's just such a arbitrary way of exerting one's dominance over someone else. My next thing is, I think it's very interesting that Toni Morrison in Setha's history talks about two types of slave owning families. Like the first one is considered more quote unquote benevolent. Just like, of course you could buy your mother-in-law's freedom if you work on the weekends or something like that. They gave them more freedom, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But they still had enslaved men whose names were Paul D, Paul F, and Paul one other letter. Because it was just like easier to just like call them like, hey, Paul, and like didn't matter which one came.
Yeah.
And it also showed that like once the benevolent slave owner passed away, the malevolent one, the like typical slave owner that we think of, comes in,
the
assaults
Django
everyone.
Unchained kind of slave owner. Yeah.
And so I think that was an interesting thing that Toni Morrison talked about, or not even talked about. She just like wrote it out and just showed how this benevolent slave owner is still feeding into this malevolent type of, just like slavery. Slavery is bad. No matter how you spin it or however way you want to justify it, slavery is bad. And it feeds into this greater, terrible system.
Well, it plays against our most, it plays against our humanity to enslave another person.
Yeah.
And I think that like Baby Suggs kind of talks about that a little bit. Baby Suggs is Setha's mother-in-law, and she's kind of this like matriarch, kind of spiritual figure. Her son bought her freedom for her. Like he worked hard for that by that benevolent slave owner. And so she's an interesting character, and she's very aware of what the spirit is. She knows that this ghost is the daughter, and she knows that it's the daughter that they call Beloved. They named the daughter Beloved, or Setha did, because at the funeral, the preacher said, "Dearly beloved." Setha interpreted that as the preacher was speaking to her dead child, not to the congregation. So her baby is beloved. So Baby Suggs kind of understands this, and Baby Suggs really represents like the power and reclamation of womanhood, of Black joy, of all of these things, while also acknowledging the institution of whiteness. Because they go into like there's the benevolent versus the malevolent. The people who even gave Setha this farm in Cincinnati were white people, and they were very kind. They even give Setha some earrings. But it doesn't matter because all white people are the same, because they're all still upholding this institution. They're upholding this system. And Baby Suggs at one point says, "Those white things have taken all I had or dreamed," and she said, "and broke my heartstrings too. There is no bad luck in the world but white folks." And I think that speaks to this thing that there is nuance in these individual characters when it comes to the white characters. And Toni Morrison gives space for that. But she also makes it very clear that the system that all of these different characters are benefiting from is completely evil, and is the reason why Baby Suggs dies the way she does, is the reason why Setha had to kill her children. It's like there's an evil there, and it doesn't benefit the white folks either. And you see that even when we talk about the more benevolent, and we say that with like quotes, slave owners. Because you're right, Eden, like there's no justification. Like someone was saying to me recently, they're like, I read a thing about Robert E. Lee, and he seems like such a great man. It was like, right, but he upheld slavery. So that doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if he's nice to his wife and his kids. He still upheld a system that oppressed millions of people generationally. So, like, it doesn't, that cancels it all out.
Yeah.
And that might not seem forgiving or whatever, but it's just the way it is. Like, you can't be a racist and still have a high moral compass. It doesn't work that way. Because if you're willing to see one person as less than simply because of the color of their skin, all your morality is just stands on sand. It'll just blow away immediately. There's no foundation for it. But I also found it interesting what you were saying, Eads, about how you identified it was very much like an us versus them, not us versus them, but an us and them kind of conversation. And as an Asian American, you were clumped in with the white students in this experience of learning. To me, that just speaks so much to the lack of nuance we have when we talk about race in our country, and when we talk about oppression, and when we talk about those things. And I don't have answers for that, but I think that is such like a poignant example. And this is why Toni Morrison's books are so brilliant, because she gets into that nuance. She shows like Setha murdered her child. That is unthinkable. That is unimaginable. Like, how could a human being do that? But she gives us a peek into her desperation. And she doesn't judge that space. Like, she gives nuance to each character. And when we talk about our country, like our experiences, I just don't think we do the same. I'd be so curious. Do you feel like there's more representation of the Asian American experience now than there was when you were in high school? Or do you feel like it's about the same?
I think there's more now, and it's complicated. Yeah, it's super interesting. And actually, it ties in with Toni Morrison's like career as as an editor.
Yeah.
Because I read a couple of books recently by Asian American writers, and a lot of them felt pressured to only write about the Asian American experience. And like talking about whose story is it to tell?
Yeah.
And like if we didn't I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it as well. But like, if you didn't, let me take it back again, because Ezra Jack Keats. Hold on, let me do a quick fact check for myself. Okay, yeah. The writer and children's book illustrator Ezra Jack Keats, most famous for Snowy Day.
Oh, love that.
Great book. But a lot of his books were about this black boy. Is it Peter from Snowy Day?
Yeah, I don't remember his name.
Yeah, it's Peter. And I could see like the conversations today being like, well, what is this white man, Polish white man, doing writing a story about a black boy? Like that should be only a story that a black writer should write.
Yeah.
But I think if we didn't gatekeep, then that allows for more diversity in publishing, because we're not saying, oh, you're Asian American, you can only write about Asian American experience.
Yeah.
Like, there could be an Asian American author who writes a Snowy Day equivalent, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, that was a long way of saying, I think representation also in the authors is as important as representation in stories, I guess.
Yes.
So like the fact that Ezra Jack Keats is white himself, but he wrote these stories of cute little black boys.
Yeah.
Like that in itself is really important as like what reading a book by a black author, though about a different population, you know?
Yeah. I agree. I think that's such an interesting conversation. And even there's colorism, because if you get into the waspy part of America, a Polish person would never be accepted into that space, you know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it really depends on who's in power and what they deem inadequate in terms of ethnic identity, and who can be representative. I think that's the thing that Toni Morrison rubbed up against a lot too, was like, is this a black book? Or is this just a book? And she has these amazing quotes. She always has like a great response about it. But for me, I think the theme that I've been thinking about a lot while I was thinking about this book and what we're going to talk about with it, that makes it universal, is this idea of suffering. That this is a story about a lot of suffering. This is a story about how the choices that people are making while they are suffering at their most. And I've been thinking a lot about, what does suffering mean and what do we get from it? And like what gives us hope in the midst of suffering. And I came to the conclusion that's kind of embodied by Baby Suggs again. Baby Suggs at one point is like tossing and turning, and she's like, I don't know what place I should be in this question about Setha's decision to kill her child. And she says, the heart that pumped out love, the mouth that spoke the word, didn't count. They came in her yard anyway, and she could not approve or condemn Setha's rough choice. She is in Baby Suggs. One or the other might have saved her, but beaten up by the claims of both, she went to bed. She just couldn't, it didn't matter. She couldn't approve it or condemn it, because she was like, I totally validate the desire not to have your child go into slavery, but also you killed your child. I don't know. And I think that allowing us to not have an answer is really helpful. There was something that happened at the end. Denver, the daughter who survived, she's growing up and she's kind of watching all of this. And the third part of the book kind of comes from her perspective. So she's watching Beloved, who is incarnated as a real human body, whose like teeth are falling out constantly. And she's aging and she's getting fat and she's doing all the things because she's eating all the food. And Seth is losing weight because she's giving all the food to Beloved in order to make up for her killing her. It's this very unhealthy codependent relationship, and Denver's getting squeezed out. And Denver's watching this, and you see Denver realize that she has to survive on her own. She can't fix her mom, and she can't save her mom from Beloved. She can't even fix Beloved at all. Like, she can't even do anything there. And so you see Denver leave her home and go ask for help from community members and prioritize her own healing and her own rejuvenation of life and all these things. And you see her heal and start to talk, start to become a person while she watches the demise of her mother, even though it's very loving, and depressing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some, like, it ends with this feeling of like absolute peace that like Denver somehow finds herself in this experience with her mother and her sister. Her allows Denver to live fully in a rebirth of some sort of way that I don't know if would have happened if she hadn't watched Beloved and her mother codependently implode. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if Denver would be able to live the full life because she now knows the suffering. So now she's choosing the joy. And I don't know, that was my take on it.
Yeah. As you were talking about it, like Beloved is the embodiment of a lot of things, but especially like grief and regret, and how like when you are in the throes of grief and regret, like how codependent that is. Like that could turn into like binge eating, and or starvation of self. And I think it's commentary on the community itself. So like you were asking earlier, is this a book or a black book? I think the lessons we can take from it as a book is how important community is in a community member's suffering. So like once the community found out, oh my gosh, like Setha killed her daughter, pariah, like we don't talk to this murderer. And so Setha, she's in this home with her 3 kids, kind of being encompassed and like saturated in the sadness. Like, yeah, Beloved has a body later, but in the beginning there is a spirit haunting the house, and that is like the spirit of grief and regret and remorse and everything, and like that. And I think it's because the community didn't show up for her when she needed it the most. Like she needed help and everyone shunned her. And so like even her 2 sons ended up leaving because they couldn't handle it. Denver was the one who actually went out and reached out to community to find life, like you were talking about. And in the end, the community did come to Setha's rescue. And like that is when Beloved starts to disappear. There are 2 things. Like I think the community comes and shows up for Setha finally. And Setha sees a white man approaching the house, and instead of turning to kill her children again, she turns to run after the white man to kill him. Which it was a case of mistaken identity at that point. Like he wasn't a bad actor.
No, I don't think so.
But it was a way of redemption for Setha, of like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have killed my, like, again, there is no like real judgment or answer to Setha's decision, but like in this case, what drove Beloved away was Setha in a way reenacting what maybe she could have done, and also a community showing up for her.
I think that's so beautiful. And I think like you also like, I don't know, another theme of the book is because it goes into so much. We're not going to cover every single thing, obviously. It's not going to happen. And it goes into so much about the cruelty of chattel slavery. They talk about the trees upon their backs, which are the scars from the whippings that make it look like a tree on their back. And there's a like kind of a love interest / a friend who was also from the same plantation who shows up and is also a witness to Beloved and the grief that's in the home and the destruction that's there. And he tries to love Setha, but Setha ultimately chooses Beloved. So there's like a lot of different characters that we're not going to get into. But to talk about what you were saying, that moment when Setha goes after the white man, it speaks to that one quote, which is, freeing yourself was one thing, claiming ownership of that freed self was another. And I think this whole book is where we see this is a person who the Emancipation Proclamation was announced and life changed drastically, but it didn't mean that their understanding of their self and their autonomy had changed. And the idea of going after the white person, the white man, was that other sign of like, oh, now she can finally fight. And like that is kind of claiming ownership of that freed self in a different way. But even then, you could argue that Setha was still embodying a lack of autonomy by the ownership that Beloved had over Setha's eventual choices, which is also really interesting. And once again, like that's what's so beautiful about Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison doesn't give judgment on any of these characters. She just explains how messy it is and forces the reader, no matter the race, or it just inspires compassion.
And it's so beautifully written too.
Ugh.
My goodness. I listened to the audiobook and Toni Morrison reads it. And it was just like butter in my ears.
Oh, I know. Gosh, I highly recommend that. She also reads Song of Solomon, and that's another one where like, listen to Toni Morrison read her own books, because it is. There was a time like she and Fran Lebowitz were doing like a talk somewhere, and Fran Lebowitz is like very famous for being like, I hate writing. All writers hate writing. In her curmudgeonly way. And Toni Morrison was like, I don't hate writing. And Fran Lebowitz is like, you're the only writer in the world that actually enjoys the craft of writing. And you can feel that from Toni Morrison. You feel like this is like an actual escape and like an actual communion. She says in her documentary, which you should all watch, I believe it's on Netflix.
I think it is, yeah.
That when she was writing, she would wake up. She was a single mom, and she'd wake up early in the morning and write for hours, and then she'd go to work as an editor. And as she was writing, one day she looked up and she saw the image of a young woman walking out of the water in like an ethereal kind of a way. She didn't understand who the young woman was, but she felt all these feelings about it. And that's who Beloved was. And that's how she came to this part of that story. And just knowing that her process was so spiritual and so visionary, and there's so much going on, is really it's really inspiring. It really motivates me to write.
Yeah.
And it feels like a sacred task for her. In the book, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, they talk about how doing the work, especially for African Americans in our country who do have ancestry who were enslaved, doing the work of their genealogy is a sacred task. And they even have like the protagonist go to sleep in all white clothing, knowing that she's communing with her ancestors as she sleeps and prepares for the next day. And I think that Toni Morrison brings that same kind of sanctity to her process. And you can feel it, because it feels like scripture reading her stories. They are messy, complicated stories, but you walk away feeling a little bit closer to humanity. And in the midst of suffering, there's moments and glimmers of hope. And I think if we can find hope while we suffer, that's when we kind of are reaching for the divine, and we can see like a little fingertip more than any other time. Because it's really hard to find hope while we suffer. But Toni Morrison gives that tangible example in all of her books of those glimmers of hope in the midst of this like unimaginable suffering that her characters go through.
Yeah. Yeah, she is brilliant. My goodness.
Were there any characters you liked a lot, or that you identified with, or characters that you just hated?
Reading it the second time, I forgot that like how scary Beloved actually is.
Yeah, I had forgotten that too. She's terrifying.
She's so terrifying. And like while I was reading it, I was just and like previous guest and friend of podcast, Micah Clements, he talks about like how no one talks about how this is a ghost story. And it's like, yeah, I would put that up there with like I feel like I would put it up there with Stephen King, of just like a very scary ghost story.
She's like Gollum-y with her teeth falling out. Her
Yeah.
hair, her weird, she's growing up, but she's also degenerating. Like, there's a lot going on there.
There's a lot going on. And
And
like
her
the fact
voice.
that
Yeah.
uh-huh. Yeah, a lot of freaky stuff. So um that was the strongest like character thing that came out to me. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, Beloved is scary.
Yeah.
She is, yeah.
Yeah.
She's not to be um messed with.
Yeah.
You brought up a few things that I do remember from my English class. One of them was the tree on her back because of that was the scars of the whip.
Yeah.
And I remember that because no one else in my class had read. And my teacher was like, "Did no one read this book? What does the tree represent?" Like
Oh my gosh.
and I did read that day, and I raised my hands
That
like,
day.
it was like, I know what the tree is. Like, the tree is like the scars on her back. And she's like, "Thank you, Eden." And that's what.
And that's the moment you knew that a teacher's pet was the only calling you ever wanted.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But the second thing was the image of Beloved coming out of the water.
Yeah.
Of just like, oh, why did she come out of the water that way? And I remember my English teacher like describing it. It's like, well, when you birth a child, water comes first. Like,
Yeah.
this is the rebirthing of Beloved, and how that was really helpful for me as a high schooler who had like a lot of this stuff kind of went over my head.
Yeah.
But it was helpful for me to have my teacher
Yeah.
describe what was going on and describe the symbolism and talk about like, oh yeah, that was a weird, or that was an interesting or a confusing scene.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that is the role of an English teacher that I think a lot of the parents who are banning books
Yeah.
are forgetting.
Yeah.
And like we aren't reading these books of our own volition.
Yeah.
As demonstrated by the fact that like I was the only one who
Well,
read
that
that
read it.
chapter. And if we are reading these books, we have a teacher to guide us.
Yes, exactly. And these teachers who are guiding us have chosen these books and have gotten them through a committee who have said this book is okay to learn at this level and it is of value at this level, whether it's for the AP testing or whether it's just for comprehension skills. This book is approved already for specific reasons. So if you're concerned that your child's going to read Beloved and you feel like it's too gruesome, ask your teacher why. Ask the teacher of that child. Like, that is okay to do. Because yeah, they will guide. I just remember feeling like this was the first time that I read something that felt like I feel like I haven't had this feeling since until I read like Russian literature. But I feel in college, but I feel like Beloved was my introduction to that kind of elegant and elevated storytelling that like gets to the nitty-gritty of the human experience in a way that nothing else ever has. And I don't think I would have been brave enough to try Dostoevsky or Tolstoy if I hadn't gone to Toni Morrison first. I really do. This is going to be a big claim, but I feel like she's our American Tolstoy in that every single character, like this last time reading it, every single character annoyed me and brought me joy and were so deep and kept evolving in ways like even the whole town evolved. Even what you're talking about, the different slave owners, they evolved in different complicated ways. Many devolved. But yeah, it was like I think it's like my foray into Russian literature was Toni Morrison.
Yeah. I would agree with you that she's our American Tolstoy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no character stayed the same throughout the book. Like Toni Morrison writes such beautifully complex characters who grow or shrink throughout. Yeah, she is fantastic. My goodness.
And every character is deserving of love. That's what was also incredible to me.
Yeah. Well, even Denver, and I wonder what you think of the symbolism here. Like, Denver is named after Amy Denver, who is a white girl who finds Setha trying to escape slavery.
Yeah.
And Setha was so pregnant and so hurt from the travel.
Yeah.
That Amy Denver basically just nursed her back to health.
I think
and then Setha named Denver after her.
Yeah. To me, I think that another book, a companion book that I would definitely read is My Grandmother's Hands. Me and Eden have talked about this so many times, but it is by, and I'm going to say this last name wrong, and I apologize a trillion times, Resmaa Menakem? We can link it. It's on Spotify for free, even if you don't have a premium account. And it's trauma, it's discussing trauma from the white supremacy lens, how white supremacy has informed American trauma, whether you are Black or white, a police officer, and it goes in, and even if you're none of those parties, you can still learn a lot about how trauma manifests and what we can do, and it gives exercises, and it's so compassionate, and it helps, as a white person, it helped me see the ways in which I have upheld the system of white supremacy. And it's also compassionately helped me figure out ways for me to try to disentangle that, I don't know, and get myself out of that enmeshment and be more conscious and practicing getting rid of that bias in my mind that I've inherited. And, but I think he says in the book, he talks about how white people must have examples of abolitionists. We must have examples of good people. And we must talk about those good people. We must talk about the people who fought against the system, who were allies, and we must name our kids after those people. And I think Amy Denver is an example of that kind of thing. I think it's also safe to say she still upheld that system of whiteness, and she was still representative of that, but she was also possibly a glimmer of hope where Setha didn't expect it. And so once again, Toni Morrison is touching on the I know I'm not on a first name basis
Toni.
with her. Yeah, it's touching on the nuance of the individual. But I think as a white reader, we should take that as an example of what we have possibility to do, or as a non-Black reader, rather.
Great book.
Do you have, what other thoughts do you have, Eden?
This book is so rich in everything.
Yes.
I think the symbolism is incredible as well. I did read this the second time alongside Spark Notes, which actually I probably did as a high schooler too. Even little things like the house they lived at was 124 Bluestone Road. And the 124 is symbolic of her children.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3 is missing 4.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a lot of symbolism in everything.
Yeah. The whole thing. There's a part of the roses that are rotting, and they're walking to the carnival as a beautiful, perfect family. You know, when Paul D shows up before Beloved gets too involved, they're walking and they can smell the roses rotting because it's the end of the season, and the smell is so pungent, and you can tell something's gonna happen. But the roses smell so sweet. So it's that I don't know, and I think about that every time I pass roses that are dying.
Yeah.
We know.
Beloved's coming.
Yeah, Beloved's coming.
Yeah, very deserving of its Pulitzer Prize. Good job, the Academy for that, or whatever.
Yeah, the Academy.
Judging. Yeah,
the Golden
Academy.
Globes. Good job.
Yeah.
I have a last quote to share.
Oh, yes, please do.
It's long, but it could act as an outro.
Yeah.
This is Baby Suggs, and I think this exemplifies Toni Morrison's writing and the beauty in the midst of the suffering. In this here place we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on my back. Yonder they flay it. And oh, my people, they do not love your hands. They only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands. Love them, raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them. Pat them together. Stroke them on your face, because they don't love that either. You got to love it, you. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream from it, they do not hear. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give you leavings instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved. Feet that need to rest and to dance. Backs that need support. Shoulders that need arms. Strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts, that they just as soon slop for hogs, you got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it. Love it, and the beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize. And I think that is the answer to suffering. The suffering will happen, but you have to figure out how to love it. And this is a love story to Black America, definitely. And as non-Black people, we can also use this text to learn how to love ourselves and how to dismantle the oppression that doesn't love us as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah. It's so beautiful.
But we need to talk about why we think this was banned.
Oh my gosh. Obviously, Setha kills her child. There's some sexuality. It talks about slavery, and we know that people don't want to feel accountable for that. So, people, as in the federal government and white people, my people, and yeah, I think that's my thinking.
Yep, that's my thinking too.
Yeah, and like also the horrors that happen on the plantation are horrific. We don't need to get into them, but the specifics of them, I think, are probably why it's banned too.
My goodness. Yeah, there's like one scene where school teacher assaults Setha, and it is
bad.
Terrible.
Yeah. And there's bestiality and other things like that. So
let's see. Beloved has been banned in many U.S. schools, including at least 11 during the 2021-2022 academic year.
What?
So, relatively recent. Common reasons are bestiality, infanticide, sex, and violence. Here's one example. In 2007, the novel was abruptly abandoned by an AP English class in Kentucky at the order of the school's principal because the class had nearly reached the end of the book when a parent complained about language on page 3 after they almost finished the book.
Yeah.
And I imagine page 13 is not as
they probably
explicit as like, yeah. But in Virginia, Fairfax County, oh my goodness, parental concern about Beloved's content inspired the Beloved Bill, legislation that would have required Virginia public schools to notify parents of any sexually explicit content and provide an alternative assignment if requested. The bill was vetoed by Governor Terry don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. And he said, I stopped the bill. I stopped the bill. I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. And just like, as plain as that.
That is fascinating.
And I will say that this podcast is named after a book that Toni Morrison edited called Burn This Book. It's a collection of essays about censorship. But yeah, we love Toni Morrison here.
We do. Yeah, we'll stand by it that she's one of our greatest masters of literature.
Before we sign off, we are starting a new thing called the Burn This Book Comment Corner.
Ooh!
Because we want to encourage you all to rate and leave a review.
Yes.
Because we take that all into consideration. We are two people just reading books and talking about them.
Yes. This is true.
But yes. So I pulled up one review. It's from Graham and M. It says, I love reading along with this podcast and finally reading a lot of classic books that I'd never read before, then hearing their commentary in the show. It's like a book club with two great friends. Amazing. Thank you, Graham and M.
Okay, that's the nicest one. I thought you were going to start with one of our angry ones.
No.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm excited to get to those, but that's so nice. We want you to be our friend.
Yeah. So we'll read all comments to encourage you to leave comment, and good or bad. We welcome them all. We're not going to censor them.
No. If you've said something mean to us, we're going to say it.
Yep.
But also, that's okay. You can say mean things to us.
Yeah.
It just hurts our self-esteem, but that's okay.
Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you for talking to me. And thank you all for joining us and being our friends.
Burn This Book is produced by us, Nicola Corin and Eden Wen.
Music by myself, Nicole, and performed by my dad, Frank.